Good morning, everyone. It's not working. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Still not working. Is it working? Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats. We're on lesson 13 this morning to wrap up our series. This has gone by really fast. For me, I hope it was beneficial. For you this morning, the topic is defending the community. And we're going to focus on Acts chapter 22, verses 30 through Acts 26, verse 32. Chapter 23, and then those chapters that follow will show Luke's inspired account of Paul's continued trials in Jerusalem at the hands of the chief priests and the Sanhedrin court. One thing that we know really well is those Jews were diehard against the way. You will recall from chapter 22 that Paul was taken captive by the Roman tribune, brought into the barracks where he was to be examined by scourging. Another word for that is flogging. The purpose was to find out why people were making accusations against him. Acts 22, verse 24. I find that ironic, don't you? They're flogging the victim. You wonder why they didn't flog the accusers. But this method of interrogation was to use an instrument called the flagellum, which was made of leather thongs, which had inserted on the ends of these thongs pieces of bone or metal that was designed to rip and tear human flesh and inflict the severest possible pain upon the victim. And you know, these Romans, they were experts in this form of torture. This form of questioning, if you will, this form of torture was far more severe than that which Paul had experienced at Philippi when he was subjected to a beating with rods, Acts 16, verse 22. And this flogging was the same kind of punishment that Jesus was subjected to in Luke 23, verses 16 and 22. Paul is tied up and prepared for the flogging, and he waits until the very last minute, the very last moment, before they begin flogging him, to ask whether it is legal to flog a Roman citizen who is uncondemned. And the Greek word Luke uses here means simply without trial. Now, certainly Paul knows the answer to this question, as do those who are inflicting the beating. You see, the question is rhetorical, isn't it? The question has its desired effect, and the Romans stop the flogging. You see, flogging for a Roman citizen was not proper as a first line of interrogation. According to Roman law, flogging was only recommended when all non-coercive means had failed to resolve the matter, or perhaps in extraordinary circumstances where it was deemed necessary. But at the very least, flogging Paul would have been a severe breach of protocol. And this was apparent to the centurion, who immediately reports that to his superior, the Roman tribune. The tribune informs Paul, and I think this is an interesting conversation, that he had to pay a lot of money in order to obtain his citizenship. But remember what Luke writes, but that allows Paul to have an additional advantage in this very moment as Paul was born a citizen of Rome. Now, no one knows how Paul was born a citizen. There have been a great deal of speculation about that. But this speculation provides more real questions than it does answers. The result of Paul's revelation is that his interrogators withdraw from their intended scenario of inflicting pain and punishment on Paul in fear. So then verse 30 acts as a transition to chapter 23. And with that brief introduction, let's pause. Let's ask God to bless our class. Will you pray with me this morning? Father, what a privilege to assemble this morning to study your word. Father, thank you for the blessing you give us in your word, the meaning, the wisdom, the relevance for today's living that we need. Even though these words were written many, many years ago, they're still fresh and new, meaningful and relevant for our lives today. And how much we need that, Father, how much we need an anchor to hold us firm in this turbulent life. Father, open our hearts to it this morning. Plant your word deeply that it might bear fruit for you, that you might be honored and glorified in our lives as we apply this word to us. Thank you for the fellowship we enjoy, the relationships that we have in Christ, the common birth that we share because you love us, Father. Thank you for Jesus. In his name, amen. Turn this on. Here we go. There we go. So the guiding questions for our discussion this morning are two. First, how does Paul try to connect with those outside the community? And second, how does Paul defend and invite while connecting? All right, testifying before the council. Chapter 23 can be broken down into these two main sections. First, Paul's hearing before the Sanhedrin Council. And second, the plot to assassinate Paul and the Roman response to foil that plot, culminating in Paul being transferred to Caesarea to appear before the Roman governor, Felix. Let's do a little bit of reading this morning. Turn to Acts 23. Let's begin at verse 1 with our reading. Luke writes, Paul, looking intently at the council, said, "Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck?" But the bystanders said, "Do you reveal God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." Let's think about this just a moment. What did Paul say to attempt to connect with his accusers? There's a key word that Luke recorded for us. It's a B word that he uses there. What does he say to connect with those accusers? Brethren. What does that indicate, brethren? What was Paul saying? What's that? Fellow Jews. See, fellow, equal. Did it have something to do with family? Brethren. Another word for brethren is brothers. Did Paul consider them to be brothers? Fellow Jews? He did. Despite all the hardship, persecutions that Paul had endured at the hands of the Jews up to this point, he still considered them to be his brothers, didn't he? He considered them to be family, and he addressed them as such. And it's clear that this greeting indicates that he holds this relationship with his brothers in greater esteem than the council members do, as they will agree in a very short period of time to participate in a plot to assassinate Paul. Now, if that's the way we treat others in our family, that's an interesting definition of family, isn't it? And that's perhaps a great lesson for us today. When it's so easy to speak disparagingly of others, here Paul tries to be respectful, at least at this point. And we will quickly see that people do not always reciprocate when respect and kindness are shown to them. We give you two guiding questions for this section of our lesson. We're going to answer these two questions a little bit later in our study. First, what did Paul mean by the phrase whitewashed wall? And number two, was Paul's accusation correct? We'll see. Before the council, Paul begins by telling them that up to this very day, he's lived a life with a clear conscience before God. The statement of Paul here doesn't conflict in any manner with what he says elsewhere. Even given 1 Timothy 1:13 through 15, indicating that previously he had done some regrettable things, but they were done in ignorance. That his behavior on either side of his conversion was ever motivated by anything other than zeal for God. And it's at this point that Ananias, who is identified by Luke as the high priest, orders those who are standing near Paul to strike or hit Paul on the mouth. And there appears to be no motive whatsoever for this action on the part of the high priest other than to simply silence Paul. Now, Luke may have intended through inspiration for his audience to see how arbitrary and injudicious the Jewish Supreme Council had become, and especially their leader, the high priest. But we knew about him, didn't we? You remember during the festival what the family of the high priest had done, extorting the people, charging them exorbitant prices for the sacrifices. We'll talk about that in a moment. At this point, Paul responds to this act by indicating that it's clearly a petty and unlawful act. And he prophesies that God will strike him, Ananias the high priest, for such an action. Did that happen? Let's see. Paul understands certainly his position before God, doesn't he? He is a spokesperson for God. And it's likely that at least some of the readers of Paul's writing later would remember that history and remember that Ananias was killed by a group of Jewish zealots in AD 66 when Israel rebelled against Rome. Josephus wrote about that in his book, The Jewish War, Book 2, pages 441 and 442. Now, Paul uses this vivid metaphor here, perhaps taken from Ezekiel 13, 10 through 15, where the image of a whitewashed wall is used to refer to false prophets. Jesus used this same metaphor in describing the hypocritical nature of the scribes and Pharisees when he said, "Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees." Remember what he called them? Hypocrites. "For you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear" what? Beautiful. But inside they are full of what? Dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Jesus was telling him that they were not only unclean, but they also had the stench of death. So Paul is making the assertion that the high priest is one whose inner character is corrupt and false, with only an outer veneer or shell of holiness. Any woodworkers in this group? You ever tried to refinish a piece of veneered furniture? And you peel that veneer off, maybe there's some gluing you have to do, but you peel that veneer off, and what's underneath? Not the same kind of wood, is it? Sometimes it's the same type of wood, but much poorer quality, right? Sometimes, depending on the price of the piece of furniture, there may even be particle board inside that. Just a little thin layer of really nice looking wood. Jack?
You used the word hypocrite, Greek word for an actor.
Yes, sir.
Wears a mask.
Yes.
Hypocrite.
Wears a mask.
Yeah, you wear a mask where you hear the voice, but you have
You're hiding. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, good point. This idea of hypocrite, as Jack said, the Greek word means actor. So you have someone playing a role. Here's the high priest who is playing a role. He was given the authority and the power over this religious council, but it was just a role for him. He had other motives. In other words, just like a mask that hides the real character of the actor who's portraying this character. And just like that piece of veneered furniture, when that veneer comes off, what you get there is probably not worth showing. It's poor quality. Thank you, Jack. Poor quality. Let's continue our reading at verse 6. But perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees, and I'm on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead." As he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Verse 9. And there occurred a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, "We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him." And as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. What defensive strategy did Paul use against the council, against his accusers? Divide and conquer. Divide and conquer. And that was easy to do in the council, wasn't it? It seems like they were already polarized in this group. What did that imply? What did using that divide and conquer strategy imply about Paul's knowledge of religious groups of that time? What did Paul know about these Jews that he was talking to?
For one thing, he took their minds more off of Paul.
Yeah, he took their minds off him, off Paul, and put them on something else. Was Paul pretty familiar with these folks? He was a Pharisee himself. He had been. Thank you. That's a really good point, isn't it? He had been a Pharisee. What was he now? Child of God. He was a Christian. wasn't he? It showed that Paul was very, very knowledgeable about this group of people that he called brethren. He was knowledgeable about this religion, this Jewish religion of the time. I mean, he was just as much a Jew as they were in terms of his history, with one exception. And that exception was Paul had seen the light, hadn't he? Literally had seen the light, and he had been converted. And his point was, and his motivation was, that so could they, if they would simply listen. What was the effect of Paul's statement upon the council? What did they do? Did they all put their arms around each other, sing Kumbaya, have a great time? What did they do? You can just kind of picture in your mind, you know, they went on opposite sides. I don't know any structure about the council. I don't know if it's like political parties today, where you had one group on one side and one group on the other side, and the two didn't meet in the middle. I'm thankful that in this spiritual sanctuary called the church, we don't do that. That we are one, and that we truly love each other, and that we help each other, and that there's a spirit of not only love, but friendship, admiration, respect, trust. But I don't see any of that in the council. Do you? I don't see it. What does dissension do? How does it affect the community? Weakens it. Very good. We've talked about it polarizing, separating. What does it do to your mind? What does dissension do to your mind? Doesn't it close? No, there's no peace. It closes your mind, doesn't it? I don't want to listen to them. My mind is shut. My mind is closed. I don't want to hear what they have to say. What they have to say doesn't matter. It renders helpful and encouraging conversation ineffective, doesn't it? Verse 11 concludes this paragraph with the Lord appearing to Paul in the night, instructing him to be a witness for the Lord in Rome, as he was in Jerusalem. During this encounter with the Lord, either in a vision or by the Spirit of the Lord himself, Paul is told to do what? Take courage. Why did Paul need to be encouraged? If you had a threat against your life, would you need encouragement? If you had people who were closed-minded, who were spiritually estranged from you, people who were brethren to you, who were family to you, who had been estranged because of their closed-mindedness, would that have caused you anxiety or stress? Absolutely. Grief? Absolutely. I mean, you can go on and on and on describing what Paul's emotional situation would have been at this point. You see, there were many obstacles in Paul's path, not the least of which was the Jewish persecution. And it was easy for Paul to become discouraged given the opposition that he faced. Would this encounter with the Lord have been encouraging to Paul? Literally brought courage to Paul? I can't help but think that as devout as Paul was, that he would have remembered Deuteronomy 31 verse 6. or Hebrews 13, verse 5, where the Lord said some very important words to him and to us, and this is meaningful for us today. What did the Lord say in these references? The Lord said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And I think that would have encouraged Paul tremendously. Verse 12 begins a new day and a new section in the story. We are told that a group of more than 40 Jews had joined themselves in a conspiracy to kill Paul. They'd taken an oath neither to eat nor drink until he was dead. Were they serious about that? Neither eat nor drink until they killed Paul. They were very serious about this threat. The phrase that they used to denote their binding themselves together with an oath was something like this. Maybe a translation word for word would be something like this. With an oath, we have oathed. And maybe another way would be, we have cursed ourselves with a curse. And so literally they are saying, may we be condemned to damnation if we do not kill Paul. They were very serious about this, weren't they? It's highly likely that these zealous men will have used precedents set within Judaism, which would have allowed them to be released from this oath, as it was going to be impossible to fulfill. This probably means that they didn't really starve themselves to death or die of thirst. They likely were not that honorable. It is of interest that at verse 14, these murderous intentions are brought to the attention of the chief priests and elders to induce them to join in the conspiracy to commit murder. Luke wants us, the readers, to understand that these supposed leaders of Israel are far more interested in what? Retaining power and authority than they are in righteousness and justice. This is another indication that they have forfeited any right they might once have possessed to lead God's people. And the contrast with them and with Paul and his attitude is striking. There's no absolute indication here that the leaders agreed with this plan to assassinate Paul. But it appears fairly obvious that they did, as they did not appear to report this to the Romans. And they actually pursue Paul to Caesarea, Acts 24, verse 1, seeking his condemnation. And in the report of Paul's nephew, their complicity in this plot is indeed reported to the tribune. In verse 16, we learn that Paul has a sister and that her son heard of the conspiracy against Paul's life. He goes and tells Paul. Paul asks for the nephew to be taken to the Roman tribune to report his accusations. And after hearing his report, the tribune asked him to tell no one that he had been informed. Then he summons two of his centurions to gather a formidable force to transport Paul to Caesarea and to safety with the governor. This is an opportunity to get rid of the one person who has been nothing but trouble and to transfer his problem to others, in this specific instance, to the governor Felix. So we finally learn at verse 26 the name of this tribune, this Roman tribune. His name was Claudius Lysias. And he writes a letter to Governor Felix explaining the situation with regard to Paul. Let's look at the trial. Paul's trial before Governor Felix is his first formal trial, though there have been several informal interrogations conducted in the previous chapter. This section contains two primary speeches, with both employing judicial rhetorical aims. Tertullus, the attorney representing the Jews, lays out the formal charges against Paul, and Paul replies in his own defense. And as always, Paul will use this as an opportunity to testify according to the way. Chapter 24 then divides into 3 sections. Section 1 is the charges levied against Paul, verses 1 through 9. Section 2 is Paul's defense, verses 10 through 21. And section 3 is the response of Felix, verses 22 through 27. Notice the context and the setting of this trial. The presence of the high priest and the retention of an attorney for the trial indicate how important the Judean leaders thought this trial was. Jack?
This just makes it so important to understand Paul being a Roman citizen.
Right.
Not only like talking to the centurion about buying his citizenship,
Right.
but the importance of Paul
Being born. That's right.
being born a
Natural. That's right.
knowing exactly all how that happened,
Right.
just the hierarchy of the
Yes.
empire.
Ye-
This was serious.
It was. And you can see God's providence working in this. Jack was talking about the importance of Paul's Roman citizenship in this. You have to believe that being born a Roman citizen protected him. But I think you will agree that was providential, wasn't it? So these men perceived Paul to be a significant threat to their way of life. They were not prepared to give up their power and their authority without a fight, literally without a fight. And the words of Gamaliel, remember I've mentioned this before several times, way back in Acts chapter 5, verses 38 and 39. Remember what Gamaliel said? Well, those words continued to echo through the hearers of Luke's account as Luke portrays these leaders here as in direct combat with God. So remember that 200 soldiers were made ready during the night to escort Paul to Caesarea, along with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. This was quite an impressive and expensive entourage to protect a single person, even a Roman citizen, which Paul certainly was. Historians have indicated that roughly 80% of the imperial Roman budget, or about 670 million sesterces, and that's in today's value around 1.2 billion with a B, billion dollars, and some estimate as much as $5 billion were spent annually just to maintain the military, with a large part of that budget being obtained from the taxation of the mostly agricultural operations of the empire. Mounts were provided for Paul to take him safely to Felix, the governor, for review of the charges that had been brought against Paul. Felix gave orders for Paul to be kept in Herod's praetorium while his accusers arrived from Jerusalem to present their charges. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias, along with some elders and an attorney, arrived in Caesarea and presented the charges against Paul to the governor. Look at what they said. They leveled some really, really serious charges against Paul, didn't they? They said Paul was not a terrorist, not a murderer, not a thief, but what? A pest. They said Paul was a bug. A bug. Like you would swat that fly away from your head while you're working. He was a bug, a pest, a plague, they said. He stirs up dissension, they said, among the Jews throughout the world, was a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Well, after all, weren't these people in a position to know firsthand what dissension was all about? You know, That Jew versus Gentile thing? They knew all about that, didn't they? Or what about that Pharisee versus Sadducee thing? They knew about that too, didn't they? They knew a lot about marginalizing and polarizing other people, didn't they? They were experts at dividing people, weren't they? And they were uniquely positioned to know exactly what was going on in the entire world, right? Tongue in cheek. Even though the Roman Empire held most of the territories of the known world. And the Romans, green light.
Turn it down till you get that back.
Okay, thank you. All right. So they knew how to polarize other people, didn't they? But since the Jews needed an excuse to prosecute Paul for spreading the gospel, for bringing joy to the cities in which he preached, for encouraging and strengthening the churches and weakening the Jewish power structure, any old excuse would do, wouldn't it? Even if they had to fabricate one, which is what they did. The accusers mentioned that Paul had tried to desecrate their precious temple by supposedly bringing in a Gentile. Isn't that ironic? Never mind that they had set up money changers there in the temple to defraud and extort their own people during the festival. They mentioned that Lysias, the Roman commander, the Roman tribune, came along with much violence, they said, and took Paul out of their hands. But from my observation, the only violence being done occurred at the hands of the Jews themselves. But there was agreement with all those who traveled with them from Jerusalem, and the charges that were presented were asserted to be true. Paul was allowed to address the charges before the governor, claiming that the charges were unsubstantiated. Paul was placed in custody, was to have some freedom, and was not prevented from visiting with friends who wanted to minister to him. Felix sent for Paul often while in custody, hoping to receive a bribe from Paul. 2 years passed while Paul remained under guard, and Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Sorry, the writing is kind of small there. Let's start wrapping up our study this morning. Why did the Jewish leadership want Paul's death? How did Paul threaten them? He threatened their power base, didn't he? How far would they go to accomplish their goal? Even to the point of murder? What biblical principle was Paul's focus during his ordeal? Paul says in Acts 23, verse 6, the hope and resurrection of the dead. Why does Paul focus so intensely on this resurrection of Jesus during his trial? What's so important about the resurrection of Jesus? Isn't that the cornerstone of our faith? Isn't it the foundation of our faith? Was King Agrippa familiar with the things that Paul had been talking about? Yes. How did Paul share the gospel in his defense before Agrippa? What did he say? What is Acts 26 all about? What does Paul do? He tells them about his conversion, doesn't he? In essence, he's saying, this is what happened to me. It can happen to you as well, if you'll open your minds. And what did Paul say is the proof of one repenting and turning to God? Luke writes in verse 20, performing deeds appropriate to repentance. So let's wrap up this series. First, the community of God, the church is a what? Is a family. And that family is made up of many diverse members with equally important yet diverse roles, all of which are vital to the mission and purpose of the church. We read about Barnabas, an example of encouragement. He was generous with his earthly possessions. He was a companion of Paul. He introduced and vouched for Paul to the Jerusalem church. He mentored Paul. But he also mentored John Mark and probably helped him overcome whatever weakness John Mark had in deciding to abandon Paul and the work in Pamphylia, Acts 13. Barnabas was probably instrumental in repairing this rift between Paul and John Mark. Barnabas was a man who led by example. Also, from the conversion of Cornelius, we come away with this phrase, what God has cleansed, no longer consider common or unclean. Well, he was speaking of food there, but he was also speaking about something else. He was speaking about God's human creation. And it's a lesson on loving the souls of others regardless of color or culture. Next, the church grew and expanded even in the midst of severe opposition from the Jews. Why? Because God's presence resides in His church. And as the kids say in Pew Packers, the church is not this building, it's the what? The people. That's where God's presence resides. And finally, why was all this possible? Because the Spirit of God was feeding and leading the community. Our job is to listen to Him. You have a family member or friend who's not a Christian. It would be an honor to study with them. Let us know if we can help with that. Thank you so much for your comments, your encouragement, and your participation in our study in this series. We have a treat for you next quarter. Our son Jim is going to be teaching you. I know you'll enjoy that study. Hope you can join us for that. Thanks very much for your presence and your comments.
Yes.